Hello, we're back, and we're going to continue our discussion of data security issues with health information management. However, instead of just talking about the threats, we're going to be talking about what we do with the threats, how we combat them, what are the different strategies. So here are some strategies for minimizing security threats. We should have a chief security officer who has administrative oversight. We're minimizing all these security threats. Typically, we have some sort of advisory or policy making group, and these people come up with guides both to thinking, the policies, if you will, and procedures, the guides to action. They should be familiar with the HIPAA security rule. And if you've ever worked in healthcare, you're familiar with the employee awareness and training that we go through. Some goals of a security program is to balance confidentiality, integrity, and availability, right? And we want to keep information confidential, yet on the other hand, we want to have it available, right? So if we said we're not going to allow anybody to have any remote access, that's really probably increasing our confidentiality and perhaps our integrity, but it's coming at the expense of the availability. So we have to kind of balance these types of things. We could increase availability by giving remote access to everybody, but then we're probably compromising confidentiality and integrity. So as you can see, it's a fine line. Some other components of an effective security program include, as we mentioned, employee awareness, education, a risk management program, right? We should be assessing these safeguards. We should have both physical and administrative safeguards. It's amazing that people want to spend all this money on expensive technology and really not do anything basic for physical safeguards, such as locking up servers, keeping them in a cooled environment, keeping them elevated off the floor so if there's and sheltered so if there's any fire sprinkler malfunction, these things don't get damaged and so on. There needs to be network safeguards, firewalls, right? Software applications. And kind of going back to administrative safeguards, more and more organizations are limiting the use of POP3 mail. In other words, the Gmail Outlook accounts. They disable those portals so you can't log into your personal email. Why? One, you should be there to do a job. The computers serve a business need. And then two, leaving that open where if somebody emails you some malware to your personal account, you inadvertently click on it. If you're logging at the workplace, you're potentially introducing that malware to the healthcare organization's network. And then, of course, we need to have disaster planning, recovery. Hopefully, we're testing these systems, and hopefully, we have data quality control processes. With the risk management program, we talk more about risk management and quality improvement. We also talk about it in legal, but basically, we're looking at what types of risk do we have with the analysis. Do we have people that are using Google Forms to collect PHI for a research study? If so, that's a bit of a risk, right? So we have to analyze those types of things. We need to have something in place that detects any incident, any potential logins to our system by any unauthorized access. And then we have to have an incident response plan and procedures. Some of the things that we do are such things as role-based access, user-based access control, and context-based access control. Let's take a look at all three of these. Role-based access is basically giving somebody's access a template. And everybody that has the same job code or the same job function has the same kind of access. Obviously, with an electronic health record system, physicians will have different access than coders. Billers will have different access than nurses, and so on. Right. So it's basically taking more of a template approach to access control. And everybody with, say, job code 51513, who's a health information management coder, will get this type of access. Everybody with who's a nurse practitioner, physician assistant, or a mid-level practitioner will get this type of access, and so on. User-based access control is a little bit similar, but has one fundamental difference. It personalizes everybody's access. And a lot of organizations are moving away from it because they want to have everybody on the same, based on their job function, have more of a role-based access control. So you don't have to micromanage hundreds or maybe thousands of different users and give them unique access. And then there's context-based. Context-based access means that maybe, for instance, a large healthcare organization like Kaiser, you have somebody who has an account in Northern California and, say, the KP Northwest region. They would have different levels of access based on what context they logged into. They log into the KP Northwest, they get one level of access. They log into another context, they get a different level of access. A lot of these you're familiar with, the passwords. Some systems now force you to change your passwords every 6 weeks. The smart cards, the tokens, biometrics. Now they have two-factor. Now we have single sign-in, so you just log in once and then that logs into all the systems. And these things are becoming increasingly more sophisticated and increasingly more common. We talked about physical safeguards, the protection. Now we have automatic logouts. So if you're not in front of a computer using a system, it will just log you out, right? And then we have administrative policies and procedures, policies being guides to thinking, procedures being guides to action. How we're going to secure information. Are we going to have people that work remotely use two-factor authentication? What are you going to do with physicians, mid-level practitioners? Do they need remote access? If so, how are we going to give it to them, and so on? And then software application safeguards. Not everybody needs to have access to every single application, right? So if there's not a business need, they don't get it, right? And then the other thing is audit trails, right? If you're using an application, it should be noting when a user that with a unique identifier logs in, uses the application and what they're doing. And then we need to do the edit checks to make sure everything's in place. Some of the things that your text goes into in a fine level of detail that you're probably familiar with is firewalls, and these could be either software or hardware that basically allows users access inside or outside. Cryptographic technologies, encryption is a big one where different ways of doing this, but it's basically encrypting data. So if it is intercepted while it's being transmitted, people can't use it, right? And then kind of similar to the digital signatures, the digital certificates, the web security protocols, and what have you. The contingency plan is what are we going to do? right? We need to have a plan for it to meet the impact level for the system. So we need to check our plan. We need to report on anything we're deficiency in. We need to test our plan, recertify our plan, and then plan for the following year testing, right? So it's not something we just do once and walk away. We keep doing it. And then disaster recovery. We have been doing this in some ways in hospitals for many, many years. We test electrical backup systems. Likewise, what we do, we have to test the backup systems for data. If you're running an optical disk backup system or using some software that kind of puts data, backs up data to the cloud, have you ever brought it down and tested it, right? Have you ever operated under the emergency mode to see if your organization can function? And then in terms of data quality processes, kind of the same things we talked about earlier, where we want to have data be consistent and data having definitions as per our data dictionary so we can make sense of it and manage your data. And again, last slide, we'll just talk about some of the functions of a chief security officer. They do the strategic planning for the information system security. They develop both data and information system security policies, things that are guides to thinking, and the procedures. In other words, the guides to action, how we're actually going to do it. They manage all the confidentiality agreements for the employees and the contractors, and I had some responsibility with that. One of the organizations I've worked for. So you have to keep some sort of electronic or paper file saying who the people are, when they sign the agreement, what have you. Need to create a mechanism to ensure that all the data security policies and procedures are followed. Coordinate the data, the employee security training. We had ours implemented once a year, and then monitor the audit trails and do risk assessment. So all these things take a huge amount of time, but it's time well worth it to prevent your organization from having a breach. And that's all I have for you. We'll see you for our last and final lecture on Chapter 10 in a little bit, where I'll continue our discussion about data security. Thanks for watching. We'll see you online. Bye now.